10,000 Athenians against 25,000 Persians. No allies, no chance. It should have been the end of Greece. But on the fields of Marathon, the impossible happened. The Persians were crushed, and one soldier ran 26 miles to deliver the news of victory. The summer sun of 490 BC burned over the Aegean Sea as sails blotted the horizon. The Persian fleet, hundreds of ships, dark as a storm, glided toward the coast of Attica. Within them waited tens of thousands of soldiers, archers from the east, cavalry from Asia, and hardened infantry who had marched beneath the banners of Darius, King of Kings. Their mission was simple: punish Athens for defying Persia, for daring to inspire rebellion among the Ionian Greeks. On the headlands of Attica, shepherds and fishermen watched in terror as the sea itself seemed to crawl with invaders. Word traveled swiftly, carried by runners to the city of Athens. Panic trembled through the streets, for Sparta, their usual ally in war, could not march immediately, bound by religious observances of the Carnia festival. Athens stood alone. And yet, they did not falter. In the assembly, voices rose and clashed like swords. Some urged retreat into the city's walls, others spoke of negotiation. But then came the call of Miltiades, the seasoned general, whose voice silenced the chamber. We cannot hide. If we yield, Athens dies, not in blood, but in shame. Better to face the storm on the plain, and let history judge our courage. Thus the Athenians marched. Some 10,000 hoplites, citizen soldiers clad in bronze, left their homes and fields to meet the greatest army the world had ever seen. Alongside them came a small force from Plataea, the only allies willing to stand with them in this hour. Fathers and sons, farmers and artisans, bound by democracy and destiny, formed ranks upon the plain of Marathon. As night fell, the two armies faced each other across the field. The Athenians lit their fires and sharpened their spears, their shields polished with care. Beyond, the Persians chanted in foreign tongues, their camp sprawling like a city of war. The plain of Marathon stretched between them, flat, open, waiting. The next dawn would decide not merely Athens' fate, but the very survival of freedom in Greece. The first light of dawn crept across the plain of Marathon, turning the sea into a sheet of molten gold. From the Persian camp came the blare of horns and the roll of drums. Soldiers stirred like an ocean of steel, tens of thousands of archers and infantry, their numbers stretching farther than the eye could see. Horsemen trotted restlessly, their mounts stamping and snorting, ready to sweep across the plain once the order came. The sheer size of the host was staggering. Opposite them, the Athenians stood in a thin line. Barely 10,000 men against an enemy 5 times their number. Their shields, marked with the letters of their city, glimmered faintly in the rising sun. Each hoplite carried the weight of bronze armor, a long spear, and the round shield that had become the symbol of their freedom. Among them walked fathers beside their sons, neighbors beside neighbors, men bound not by a king's command but by the choice of their assembly. General Miltiades rode along the line, his voice strong despite the tension in the air. Men of Athens! Look across the plain. Yes, their numbers are vast, but their hearts are chained to a master. They fight for tribute, for a king who calls himself divine. You, he raised his arm toward the city behind them, you fight for your wives, your children, your homes, and the freedom of all Greece. Which is the stronger cause? A roar answered him, a surge of voices that carried across the field. Shields struck against spears, a rhythm of defiance echoing like thunder. The Persians, seeing their enemy so few and so bold, laughed in disdain. They expected the Greeks to hide behind walls, not to stand openly on the plain. Datis, the Persian commander, smirked as he looked over the field. They come to us as lambs to the slaughter, he said to his captains. Yet in the Greek line, there was no fear, only grim determination. They knew the odds, but they also knew what was at stake. If Athens fell, all of Greece would follow. The sun climbed higher. The plain shimmered with heat. Two worlds stood face to face, empire and freedom, tyranny and democracy. The silence before the storm was unbearable, as though even the gods leaned in to witness what would come. The Persians expected hesitation. They believed the Athenians, so few in number, would wait behind their shields, trembling, until the tide of Asia swept over them. Yet Miltiades had resolved otherwise. At his signal, the Athenian line advanced, not cautiously, but at a run. The hoplites surged forward, bronze greaves pounding the earth, shields locked together in a wall of determination. To charge across open ground against archers seemed madness, yet Miltiades had calculated carefully. If the Athenians closed the distance quickly, they would avoid being decimated by Persian arrows. Better to risk exhaustion than to stand and be cut down from afar. From the Persian lines, disbelief turned to shock. "They run at us," cried one officer. Datis himself rose in his saddle, astonished. Never before had he seen an enemy hurl themselves into the storm willingly. The sky darkened with arrows. A hiss filled the air, followed by the sickening thud of shafts striking shields and armor. Men fell, pierced through the gaps of bronze, but the line did not break. Step by step, the Athenians closed the ground, until at last the two forces met with a crash like thunder. The clash was brutal. Persian infantry, lightly armored, were driven back by the weight of Greek bronze and the discipline of the phalanx. Spears thrust forward in unison, piercing through linen and leather. Shields slammed into bodies, knocking men to the ground where they were finished by short swords. Yet the Persians were not weak, they fought fiercely, their numbers overwhelming. The Greek center bent under pressure as waves of Persians pressed forward. It seemed for a moment as though the Athenians might be swallowed. But on the wings, where the Athenian lines were strongest, the hoplites began to drive the enemy back. With discipline and unity, they pushed the Persians outward, creating a crescent that threatened to encircle the invaders. Miltiades, standing behind the line, saw it unfold. His gamble was working. The Athenians had not only survived the first storm, they were beginning to turn it. Still, the field was chaos, the screams of dying men, the crash of bronze against steel, the reek of blood and sweat. Freedom and empire clashed in a storm that shook the plain of Marathon. At first, the Persians pressed hard at the Greek center, confident that sheer weight of numbers would crush the Athenians. Their archers loosed volley after volley at close range, while infantry surged with curved blades and wicker shields. The Greek line bent inward, men falling beneath the press, bronze shields clattering as the center threatened to break. But Miltiades had foreseen this. He had deliberately thinned the center of his army, strengthening the flanks instead. And now the trap was closing. On the wings, the Athenians and their Plataean allies fought with grim determination. The Persian light infantry, unprepared for the crushing weight of the hoplite phalanx, began to give ground. Step by step, the Greeks advanced, spears thrusting in unison, shields locking tighter, their bronze armor gleaming beneath the sun. The cry of Enyalios, their battle shout to the god of war, rolled like thunder across the plain. The Persian wings faltered, then collapsed. Soldiers broke and ran, trampled beneath their own fleeing comrades. And as they scattered, the Athenian flanks wheeled inward. Like jaws of bronze, they curved around the Persian center, trapping tens of thousands in a tightening ring of spears. Panic erupted. What had begun as an overwhelming advance turned into a slaughterhouse. Pressed from all sides, Persian soldiers screamed, unable to wield their weapons in the crush. Horses reared, throwing riders into the mass of men. Blood ran dark across the trampled earth. From his command position, Miltiades raised his arm, his eyes blazing. "Drive them to the sea," he roared. And the Athenians obeyed. Step by step, they pressed the Persians back, their formation unbroken, their discipline unyielding. The great king's men, who had crossed the sea with dreams of conquest, now found themselves choking in fear and blood. The plain of Marathon, meant to be Persia's triumph, was turning into its tomb. And yet, the Persians still had their fleet anchored nearby. If their men could reach the ships, they might regroup, sail to Athens, and seize the undefended city. The battle was not yet truly won. The trap had sprung, and panic spread through the Persian ranks like fire through dry grass. Thousands broke formation, throwing down shields and weapons, sprinting desperately toward the safety of their fleet. Officers shouted in vain, their voices drowned by the roar of fear. Horses bolted riderless, wagons overturned, and men trampled one another in the chaos. Miltiades saw their intent at once. To the shore, he commanded. Do not let them escape unpunished. With a great shout, the Athenians pressed forward, driving the enemy across the plain. The clash of bronze against flesh gave way to the thunder of feet, as the Greeks pursued relentlessly. The sun glared mercilessly, turning the field into a furnace, the air thick with the stench of blood and sweat. The chase reached the shoreline, where the Persian ships waited with sails half raised. Desperate soldiers splashed into the surf, clambering up gangplanks as their comrades fought to hold back the pursuing Greeks. On the beach, the fighting turned savage. Hoplites hurled themselves at the boarding parties, dragging Persians from ladders, cutting down those trapped on the sand. One Persian ship was seized entirely, its crew slaughtered or captured, its hull stained with blood. Another nearly fell before the Athenians, until the defenders fought with such ferocity that even the bronze wall of the phalanx could not force them away. Still, the cost was heavy. Among the fallen was the brave Polemarch Callimachus, pierced by countless arrows as he tried to seize a ship's sternpost. His death was a bitter price, yet his valor inspired those who fought beside him. At last, the Persian fleet tore itself free from the shore, leaving behind burning wrecks, drowned soldiers, and thousands of dead upon the sand. The Athenians stood panting on the beach, their shields scarred, their spears broken, their bodies drenched in sweat and blood, but the invaders were in full retreat. The plain of Marathon belonged to Greece. Yet Miltiades was not satisfied. As he looked across the sea, he knew the Persians might still sail around Cape Saunion and strike undefended Athens. The battle was won, but the race to save the city had just begun. Victory had been won on the plain, but Miltiades knew the danger was not over. The Persian fleet, though bloodied, still held the sea. If Datis and his captains chose, they could sail south around Cape Saunion and land their forces directly at Athens. The city stood nearly undefended, its women, children, and elders left behind in trust of the hoplites. A single Persian landing could undo everything. Miltiades gathered his commanders on the blood-stained shore. "We must not rest," he declared. "The Persians will strike at Athens itself. We march now, at once." The order was brutal, his men were exhausted, their armor heavy, their throats parched from battle. Yet not a single soldier protested. They shouldered their shields once more, tightened their sandals, and set out at a relentless pace across the rugged ground back to their city. Among them, one runner was chosen for a task even more desperate. Phidippides, famed for his swiftness, was ordered to carry the message of victory to Athens without delay. Without pausing, he set off, his stride devouring the miles, his lungs burning with every breath. The path was merciless, over hills, through dust and heat, across stony ground that tore at his feet. Yet he ran with the fire of a man possessed, knowing the fate of his people depended on him. Behind him, the Athenian army marched as quickly as weary legs could carry them, their formation stretched across the Attic roads like a moving wall of bronze. Hours later, as the Persian fleet rounded the cape, its sails billowing with ominous intent, the Athenians appeared upon their own city's horizon. Armor glinted in the setting sun, banners whipped in the wind. When the Persian captain spied them waiting in full strength upon the shore, their will faltered. The chance was lost. The fleet turned away. And even as the ships retreated, Phidippides staggered into the city, collapsing before the magistrates. With his final breath, he gasped the words that would echo through ages, "Rejoice. We are victorious." Then his heart gave out, and he fell lifeless, his duty fulfilled. Thus, through blood, bronze, and sacrifice, Athens was saved. When Phidippides' final cry rang out in the agora, the city erupted. Bells tolled, women wept with relief, children shouted in the streets, and elders raised trembling hands to the heavens in gratitude. Athens had been spared, not by walls or kings, but by its own sons who had stood against the greatest power the world had yet seen. The army soon arrived, bronze armor still stained with blood and dust. Citizens rushed to meet them, embracing fathers, brothers, and husbands. The plain of Marathon had claimed many, but those who returned were greeted as heroes. Songs rose spontaneously in the streets, hymns to Athena the protector and to Ares the war god. Yet beneath the joy was sorrow. Families sought loved ones among the ranks, and when they found none, their cries pierced the celebration. Mothers tore their garments, wives beat their breasts, children clung to empty shields carried home in remembrance. Victory had saved Athens, but it had not spared its people from grief. That night, in the assembly, Miltiades stood before the citizens. His voice was steady, though his eyes carried the weight of the dead. This day, he declared, our democracy has proved stronger than tyranny. Free men, fighting for their own city, have broken the armies of a king who calls himself master of the world. Let every Greek know that the Persian is not invincible. Marathon is our answer to his pride. The people roared approval, yet even in triumph, the Athenians were humble. A mound was ordered to be built upon the battlefield itself, not for generals alone but for every citizen soldier who had fallen. It would stand as a reminder that freedom was bought with sacrifice, and that no man was too small to shape history. As the fires of celebration burned through the night, a quiet truth settled over Athens: this victory was more than survival. It was a statement to the world, that Greece, though small and divided, could resist the might of empire. Marathon was not the end but the beginning of a struggle that would echo across the ages. Days after the battle, the Athenians returned to the plain of Marathon. The air still carried the bitter stench of death, and the ground was scarred with broken shields, shattered spears, and the dark stains of blood. Birds circled overhead, scavengers picking at the countless bodies of the fallen Persians, left unburied in heaps that stretched toward the sea. But for their own dead, the Athenians reserved honor. They gathered the bodies of fathers, sons, and brothers who had given their lives for the city. With solemn ceremony, they carried them on biers of olive branches, each man borne by comrades who marched with lowered spears. The sounds of mourning filled the air, flutes played dirges, women keened softly, and even the hardest veterans wept openly. Miltiades himself oversaw the rites. These men, he said, his voice ringing across the plain, did not fall for gold, nor for conquest, nor for the command of a tyrant. They died for Athens, for freedom, and for the right of every citizen to stand as equal beneath the law. Let their names be remembered for as long as the sun shines upon Greece. Instead of scattering their dead in individual graves, the Athenians chose a single, monumental tomb. They raised a great earthen mound on the battlefield itself, a kurganos that would stand for eternity as witness to their valor. Stones were laid, earth heaped high, and offerings made to the gods, libations of wine, garlands of laurel, and the sacrifice of black rams to Hades. As the mound grew, it became not just a tomb but a monument of defiance. Every traveler who walked the road by Marathon would see it and remember, here free men had stood against a king's might and prevailed. When the last rites were complete, the army turned back toward the city. Behind them, the mound rose solemn and silent, a hill of heroes watching over the plain where freedom had been won. And in the years to come, every child of Athens would learn to speak the name Marathon with pride, as a place where courage had carved its mark into history. News of the victory spread across the Greek world like wildfire. Messengers ran from city to city, bearing the astonishing truth: Athens had faced the Persians alone, outnumbered 5-1, and triumphed. In Corinth, Thebes, and the islands of the Aegean, men gathered in marketplaces to hear the tale. Many had expected Athens to be crushed, its walls torn down, its people enslaved. Instead, the Persians had been hurled back into the sea. Awe mingled with disbelief. If Athens could resist the empire of Darius, perhaps all Greece could. Even in Sparta, where tradition and ritual had delayed their march, pride and shame mixed in equal measure. When their warriors finally reached Marathon days too late, they beheld the field of Persian dead, and the mound of Athenian fallen. The Spartans, who rarely praised outsiders, bowed their heads in respect. Truly, one is said to have murmured, "The Athenians are no lesser men than we." Across the sea, in the courts of Persia, the news was received with fury and unease. Darius, the great king, could scarcely believe that his mighty host had been scattered by mere citizens. He swore vengeance, ordering preparations for an even greater invasion to crush Greece once and for all. Yet for all his rage, the myth of Persian invincibility had been shattered. In Athens, confidence blossomed. The city had not only saved itself but proven the strength of its democracy. Ordinary farmers, craftsmen, and merchants had stood as hoplites and defeated the King of Kings. Pride filled the agora, where citizens declared Marathon not just a battle but a rebirth of Hellenic spirit. Yet wise men saw deeper. They knew the Persians would return, in numbers greater than before. Marathon was not the end of a struggle but the opening act of a greater drama. Still, it had lit a flame, one that would burn through the coming years, guiding Greece through the storm of empire. And so, Marathon became more than a place, it became a symbol, a word to inspire courage, a proof that free men could stand against the vastness of tyranny and prevail. Years passed, but the name of Marathon never faded. It lived on in song and story, in the whispers of poets and the speeches of orators. Every child born in Athens grew up with the tale that their fathers had stood against the mightiest empire on earth and triumphed. The mound on the battlefield became a sacred place, where offerings were left each year to honor the fallen, and where travelers stopped to marvel at the courage of free men. The story of Phidippides, too, grew into legend. The image of the lone runner, staggering into the city with victory on his lips before collapsing in death, captured the soul of Greece. His sacrifice embodied the spirit of Marathon, to give all for the sake of one's city and freedom. Generations later, his run would be remembered not merely as a feat of endurance, but as the very symbol of devotion to one's homeland. For Athens, Marathon was more than a victory, it was a transformation. The city, once a struggling polis among many, now stood at the forefront of Greece. Confidence surged, democracy seemed vindicated by the blood of its citizens. The Athenians began to see themselves not as survivors, but as defenders of Hellenic freedom. When the Persians would return with even greater force a decade later, at Thermopylae and Salamis, the spirit of Marathon would march with every Greek who lifted a shield or drew a sword. And yet, Marathon also spoke to the world beyond Greece. It was proof that empires, no matter how vast, could be challenged. It was the beginning of an idea, that courage and unity could outweigh numbers and tyranny. That idea would echo across centuries, far beyond the olive groves of Attica. As the sun set over the mound of heroes, casting long shadows across the plain, one truth became eternal: Marathon was not just a battle. It was the birth of legend, the dawn of a people who would go on to shape the very foundations of the Western world. Thus ended the tale of Marathon, not as an ending, but as a promise, carried in the hearts of all who believe that freedom, once won, must always be defended.